Yeah, and I think you actually did an incredible job at showing compassionate pro-life dialogue on the Joe Rogan podcast. So do you have any tips for engaging with your average pro-choicer in terms of trying to change their mind, especially when they get personal, as Joe Rogan did? He brought up the possibility of his 14-year-old daughter getting pregnant.
When I sat down with Rogan, you know, there's no preparation for what you're going to talk about. There's no show notes. You know, there was no dialogue with him beforehand other than when I showed up at the studio and was meeting his security and everything, and we were just chatting about what was going on that day. Like, we didn't talk about what we were going to talk about on the show. And that's purposeful for him. He just wants it to be a very, you know, natural, organic dialogue. And so I didn't know what was coming. The topic of abortion kind of blindsided me that way, and I felt like in the moment, I felt like I handled it well, but in retrospect, you know, with everybody commenting on it and everything, I did get a lot of very positive feedback for how I, you know, stayed calm and engaged him thoughtfully without getting drawn into that kind of like the passionate, extreme examples and getting heated and passionate in response. And I think that's important. I think it's important when you're engaging with people to stay level-headed and to stay rational and to try to the extent that you can, to leave the emotion out of it. I think the left tries to use emotional arguments a lot, and they need to be met with rational responses that aren't equally as emotional. But I think really the most effective tactic that I found just in my engagement with people, and I didn't do this a lot with Rogan, I found a couple ways to do it, but the most effective tactic is not necessarily to have like a go-to argument that you're gonna pull out and say, this is my argument. It's to ask good questions. You ask questions that kind of lead them into a place where maybe they find themselves confronting a contradiction of theirs, you know, where they think of one thing in certain terms, but then you ask enough prying questions about it and then they realize, oh, wait a minute, I've just caught myself in a trap. And you can do that without even advancing an argument. You can show them that there's a problem with their arguments. A good example of that would be like when they talk about autonomy, you know, this need for personal bodily autonomy and the importance of that and how a woman should have bodily autonomy. And you're like, okay, so what about a woman who has a child already? Let's say it's an infant just recently born. Does that woman have a right to bodily autonomy that trumps everything else, including the needs of the child? And you can start asking questions about that, like, okay, well, she's got to use her body to feed the baby, she's got to care for and protect the baby, and this is like a round-the-clock job. I have kids. I know what it was like for my wife to be at the beck and call of this child whenever it was crying and needing her help and her nourishment. And that is just, when you start putting it in terms like that and you ask those kinds of questions, well, they'll quickly realize, well, yeah, there is a need there, and they do have to give up their body and the resources. If they don't, they're neglecting the child. And that's criminal. So you can start asking those questions without even offering an argument. I think that's very effective.